As thousands of protesters across the nation continue to march against police brutality, their voices are getting louder and they are slowly being heard. Today, the governor of Minnesota announced the launch of a civil rights investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department to root out systemic racism.
Joining us now to discuss the details of this investigation is our chief legal correspondent, Dr. Laura McNeal. Good to see you as always, Dr. McNeal.
Thank you.
How significant are these civil rights charges against the Minnesota Police Department?
They are very significant, Laverne, and I'm so excited because what it says is that our voices are being heard. To those thousands of protesters around the country, there's action. Granted, it's a baby step, but a step in the right direction. And so it's wonderful that what they're saying is we're going to do a fine-tuned comb. We're going to take a fine-tuned comb over this police department. We're going to look at every policy and practice, and we're going to find out if there is any racism, and we're going to root it out of that department.
And in that light, what types of civil rights violations specifically are they going to be investigating?
A lot. So typically they're First Amendment violations, Fourth Amendment, and the 14th Amendment. So things such as racial disparities and stop and frisk. Are more African Americans being stopped as opposed to their white counterparts? They're also going to look at allegations of misconduct by the police departments. And so were they handled correctly? Were they typically against minorities within the Minneapolis community? So essentially they're going to look for pattern and practices of racial bias within that police department's practices and their actions out in the streets of Minneapolis.
And what are some of the possible legal consequences for the Minnesota Police Department?
They can be pretty costly, to be quite honest. So essentially what potentially could happen is a consent decree can be signed with the court, which essentially will mean that they will have court supervision over that police department based on the recommendations that come out of this investigation. For instance, mandatory racial bias police training, mandatory monitoring of stop and searches that are occurring in the streets, of any type of misconduct allegations, as well as any type of bias that is shown in a policy or practice. They'll have to continuously monitor that, and the court supervision will be in place until they can show that they have remedied all of the racial bias within that department.
Now, I know this is in the early stages here, Dr. Laura, but how do these charges compare to, say, those launched against the Ferguson Police Department in Missouri after the killing of Michael Brown?
That is such a phenomenal question, Fred, because they're so similar. It's kind of like the same situation in the sense that we saw the systemic racism that was found in the Ferguson Police Department. Their investigation was by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, meaning the Department of Justice. This is by the State Department of Justice within the state of Minnesota. But the principles are the same. They're going to look for that same, again, pattern and practice of racial bias in those policing practices. And similar to the Ferguson outcome, I'm expecting or predicting they're going to require, again, mandatory police training, for instance, in using the minimum amount of force necessary as opposed to excessive force. And what's so important about these types of investigations is they're really targeted at not just changing the policies and practices of these police departments, but the culture. And that's what needs to change, not only here, but abroad as well.
All right, she is Dr. Laura McNeal, BNC's chief legal analyst. Thank you, as always, very so much.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.